So when Dawn preached last, she said that I always get it easy because I get to preach on love, and she had to preach on the brood of vipers. So I have taken up the challenge, and I'm going to preach on the winnowing fork. But first I need to put this little thing aside. When I hear this passage that Joyce read for us, and it talks about the chaff being thrown into the burning fire, I revert quickly back to my fundamentalist background and start thinking that I'm going to be thrown into a fiery furnace for eternity after I die because I'm a bad person. Now, let us put that away. I don't know if any of you have that sort of background that I do, but Jesus was a Jew, and in Judaism there is no hell to speak of. So that whole fiery furnace came after in Christianity, all right? So he's not talking about that. So I have to put that aside. And so this is where I'm going to start, where I always start, and that is with love. I always start with love because that is the essence of our being. And in this particular passage, we start with Jesus' baptism, in which the heavens open and all creation resonates with a voice that says, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And if you remember, I don't know, not the last time I preached, maybe the time before that, and I came down with you and I looked in some of your eyes and I asked you to feel that in your bones you are a beloved child of God, in whom God is well pleased. And I ask you, if you were here, to take yourself back to that moment and feel that again. And if you weren't here then, to see if you can find that place inside of you in which God speaks those words, that you are a beloved child of God, in whom God is well pleased. Because I need you to be grounded in that, because I'm about to ask you to do something hard. I'm about to ask you to take up your winnowing fork. Now, in this analogy, in the agrarian society in which Jesus lived, it resonated with a whole lot of people. But not so much for me. So I went to the internet to see what we were talking about here. And I found a marvelous video on YouTube, which I would have shown, but it would have taken up too much time, and then you wouldn't have been able to hear me say anything. So in this video, it shows an agrarian scene in which wheat is harvested and milled and turned to bread. Now, I know a little bit because my father grew up on a farm, and he tells about how when he was young, they would plant the wheat in the field, and then Andrew, my grandfather, would send the boys out into the field. My father's the youngest of 4. So Milton, Clements, Armand, and Leon. I reversed those. Milton, Armand, Clements, and Leon would be sent out to the field. So let's say they're 6, 8, 10, and 12. And they're out in the field in Wisconsin amidst the wheat. And they're pulling out the mustard plants. Because you don't want to harvest the weeds with the wheat. So they're pulling out all day long under the hot sun in the prairie. Brothers pulling out the weeds. Now from this video then, back in my dad's time, there were combines and other such machinery that I can't actually think of the names right now, harvesters. But on this video, they'd go out with a scythe and they'd cut the sheaves of grain. And then they'd bring the grain to the threshing floor. In this case, it was just an empty space in a field. And there's ways of harvesting those little kernels of wheat off the long stalks. You could pound it on the ground and break the stalks and the wheat would fall down, or you could hit it with a stick. You could bundle it with your feet and kind of work it with your feet until it breaks and the kernels come off. You could use the power of a horse and put a pallet behind, harness to the horse, put a little weight on the back of the pallet, maybe 2 5-year-old girls, and drag that with the horse over the grain, in which the stalks then break off and the wheat falls to the ground. Now you take your winnowing fork, like a pitchfork, a little different angle to it, and you pick it up and you use it to grab those stalks, the big chunks, and you throw it on a pile, where later it will be used to fuel the fire in which you bake the bread to feed your family and your community. And then there's another step. All right, we've got the big stuff moved away. Now we come and we pick up these piles and we put it in something that looks like a sieve. I used to do that on the beach when I was a little kid. You'd put the sand in and the little stuff would fall through and you get the big rocks. Same sort of thing. You take it, you shake it, the grain falls through onto the ground, the bigger stuff is there. You throw it on the pile to be burned in the furnace where you bake the bread that feeds yourself and your community. Now at our feet is that pile of grain. There are still impurities in there. So we're not done yet. Not yet done. Now we take a basket, a woven flat basket, and we take our hands and we dump this pile of grain and dirt and little bits of chaff and rocks into our basket, and we start flipping it. You flip it, and the wind comes and it blows that chaff, and you're keeping the grain, you're keeping the heavy stuff in here, the good stuff that you're going to be able to feed your family with. And yet we are not done. Then you have to sit down closely and look. Pick out the rocks. Pick out the little pieces of chaff. Pick out those impurities that are not going to nurture us, but are going to harm. That whole process is contained in that one little phrase in the gospel. And it spoke so clearly to the people in Jesus' time of what is required of them for spiritual growth, to nurture yourself spiritually and the people you love. So I'm going to ask something different of you. Just for a few minutes today, I'm going to ask you to think. Well, Norman plays a little music. I'm going to ask you to think about those pieces of chaff that you need to put your shoulder to this morning and use that winnowing fork and remove from your life. It's kind of a good time of the year to do that. The new year, time of new beginnings. We we all use our New Year's resolutions. Well, let's have a spiritual resolution this morning. I want you to think of what that might be. It could be jealousy. It could be impatience. It could be drinking too much. It could be resentment. It could be anger, lack of forgiveness. And I want to have you imagine picking up that winnowing fork, feeling the weight of it in your hands, feeling your muscles move as you dig into that pile of chaff and throw that which does not feed you or your community onto that pile that will ultimately be used as fuel to work the ovens that bake the bread that sustains us all. So just a few minutes, if you would. So I didn't ask you to do anything different than what Jesus did. You know, in the next chapter, chapter 4, Jesus gets led out into the desert by temptation. And there he applies the winnowing fork to his own life. And why? Well, so that he could live into the call of his life, so that he could live into doing and being and becoming who God intended him to be. You know, there's a Buddhist story. There's two people that are, their call in life is to push this big rock up a hill. And it's very steep. It's a very big rock. It's weather like today, cold, miserable, slippery. And so they push this rock, these two individuals, up this hill, and it's hard. And they slip and they fall, and the rock falls back again. And they do this over and over and over again. And at one point, one of these individuals can see that the person next to him is really not holding his own, really not contributing the same way that he is. And at that moment, this individual is faced with a choice. And so he thinks, well, I could be angry at this other person. They're not doing their part. I could have resentment. I could wish that I could take a break and they couldn't, or they didn't. But instead, he looks upon this other individual and has compassion and says, you rest. Let me carry the load. And the story says that it is at that moment when that light of compassion enters